If you want to know how this 6.1 incher is capable of being one of the most dominant tier 9 tank destroyers in the game right now, then of course stay tuned for this video. Now today we have a 6-inch package and it's way bigger than average on World of Tanks. Yeah, I mean, pretty sus, but the whole point is that the T95 is a fantastic vehicle. It has 155mm main armament with the capability of going through the front of most of the top tier heavy tanks in tier 10. But how and why should you actually play this thing? Well, of course, other than the fact that you have 750 alpha damage and the penetration that is basically a big FU to most of the heavies at the tier and of course a tier higher, then yeah, you are pretty much a rolling fortress. There is very little at the tier that is capable of reliably penning you unless they get kind of lucky to hit the cupolas. I mean, granted, most people, if they are skilled at aiming and you know how to aim, can pen the T95. It has this weak point here, this weak point here, and of course the lower plate, which is possible to be penned, but it is very unlikely. And when this tank is dealing 750 damage to you, poking against this thing is just not a good idea, and hence why you've been able to see him take apart a lot of tanks already and pick up 4,000 damage. Now a Type 4 heavy, obviously pretty thick armour. You'd be expecting to maybe bounce around, but when the Type 4 is made of flat plates against APCR ammunition that the T95 has with 320 pen, there is basically no chance that this Japanese tier 9 heavy is going to be able to really do anything, and let alone the fact as if he is firing the HE rounds, it just isn't going to work. Of course, this tank loves it when it gets a little bit steamy in the game, and when it all does get hot and steamy, this tank will dominate and it will basically ruin the opponent's days. I mean, you're seeing here so many tanks all pushing towards it, trying to pin it down. There's not a lot that they can do, unless of course you are aiming fully, but in a scenario where you're trying to poke out quickly against the T95, it's not always easy to be able to reliably pen those cupolas, since you're going to be pulling out side on, or you're going to be pulling out really quickly behind rubble to get a free shot of damage or try and get a shot of damage, and when this thing is pegging you for 750, yeah, I mean it just never goes well. So if you're enjoying how crazy this game is going so far, please do consider subscribing and liking the video, as it really does massively help out the channel, and I always appreciate your support. But more importantly is that with no support behind the T95 right now, the Waffenträger has been able to land around in him, and at this point you have to push in the T95, which is not its favourite attribute. 20 kilometers an hour top speed means that this thing ain't going anywhere very fast. But it doesn't need to go fast, because you can always sneak up and find the opponents. I mean, as much as a tank that is gigantic and has a big slab of hit points that can be farmed if you get round a T95, it doesn't necessarily always get spotted, and that's because it has okay camo. I'm not going to be saying this is actually brilliant at being able to remain undetected. It isn't, but it does have a little bit. And although you can't really use it in an aggressive sense, sometimes you can play that more passive role and it can work out okay. So it's time to talk about the map now, because of course at this stage in the battle it no longer becomes about the tank really, it becomes about what the map and the typical composition of the map at this late stage. Now of course this is an kind of an assault game mode whereby the enemy team have to either kill all of the vehicles on the enemy team or of course cap, and it's looking like they have to kill every single tank in the game. And when you're in a Type 4, it probably isn't going to happen, because of the fact that this thing is not going to be able to reliably pen the T95, because although looking down into the vehicle is going to be able to give you a better chance of penning those cupolas, since you flatten out the angle of them, because you're looking down into them. Of course they're angled and sloped upwards, allowing people that are above you to shoot down and pen them quite easily. It's just not reliable, and they're probably not going to be able to do a whole lot. And with only 40 seconds left on the clock, trying to whittle down the last remaining hit points of the T95, it's just probably not going to happen. And that's exactly why the T95 is just a pain in the backside to actually come up against. I mean, things like the Waffle, they have good penetration, but when you angle or hide the cupolas, they basically have nowhere to pen you. So if you can find yourself up against the building and you're reversing round, it can be quite useful. You can get tracked, however, which is not particularly great, but of course in this late stages, the game's already won. So I know what you may be asking. Well, if it can do that to a tier 10, what is it gonna do to a tier 7 or a tier 8 tank? Well, it does that. And of course, this is not an actual kind of irregular occurrence, and you can see this happen quite often because of that big 6.1 incher that we've been talking about at the start. And when you do have that high caliber, you of course do a ton more module damage, which is going to be able to increase your chances of ammo racks, of destroying the engine, setting people on fire. It has all of that jazz, and the T95 is almost the king. But for 1 second, I want to direct your eyes to the keep your eyes on the minimap emblem that you're seeing here. One of the most crucial things you can do in World of Tanks if you want to get better, and thought that was a funny one to see on the side of the T95. Now this position on a mountain pass is yet again one of the not a very nice position for the enemy team, because what happens when a T95 gets above you, well, what happens is that the cupolas become even more accentuated, or the angle on them becomes even more accentuated, meaning that they're going to have to shoot up into your cupola, which when it is already angled is going to basically mean that most people aren't going to be able to pen them, even if they do hit the cupolas, meaning that you are basically invulnerable when you do get into a position like that, which is why if you possibly can get above an opponent, it is very nice. Now, one thing that you should be noted of though is that the lower plate of this thing can be penned if they're looking up to you and you expose it, but that's why you would want to avoid exposing your upper plate. So putting your shot of damage, pulling back so that your lower plate is covered by the ridge or whatever you're kind of looking down from, and that way you are basically invulnerable in the T95. So what do you do when you're faced with a big fat German heavy? Well, of course you pen them and high roll for 919. I mean, that's just a feels bad for the Maushan. Trying to side scrape, it's never gonna happen. It's just not gonna work against the T95, especially with that premium penetration and standard round penetration that this tank gets. 276 on its standard rounds with 320 on its premium rounds, meaning most vehicles that you come up against are basically a pen from the front, even those top tier heavies, let alone the same tier heavy tanks that you'll meet like the Maushan. Now unfortunately for the Somua, he obviously doesn't understand that the T95 gets the Russian RNG and he manages to plow around into his turret. Now the game is not looking all too good at this current moment in time. You have 5,000 hit points left on the enemy team with things like the Maushan, the Tiger II, the Skoda T50, which is very dangerous at this point in the game, along with the Sharfu Tier 4, which is also very dangerous, being the fact that both of them are tier 9 auto-loading medium tanks that obviously have the ability to get around the side of the T95, and if working in tandem they are going to be able to surprise. But surprise not is the T50, who manages to side scrape, or I don't even know what he was trying to do. He was angling himself up quite nicely for the T95 to land around into him, and it's basically him back to the garage. And that actually secures not only the T50, but for some reason the Shah also up there, maybe hoping to come down that hill and get around the T95 for the easy win. But this is no easy win against a player that obviously knows what they're doing. Now I've loved watching every minute of both of these replays on the T95, and if you've enjoyed as well, please do think about liking the video once again. But the key thing that I wanted to showcase to you guys today is that you don't always have to have these super meta vehicles that have the top speed. You can still have a ton of fun playing in tanks like the T95, which rely on having that armor, which granted in World of Tanks up against premium rounds doesn't always work, but it is for sure very, very fun to see when it does work. And of course you play for those really limited games where you don't tend to be able to actually do what the T95 is doing right here. And oh no, the IS-2 comes from behind, obviously doesn't aim for some reason, don't quite know what he was trying there, but gives the T95 a chance to save one shell of hit points worth from the IS-2, and in doing so actually dooms himself. So not aiming is always one of the worst decisions you can do in World of Tanks, even if you think that your team are going to win, even if there are 5 vehicles left alive, especially when you're 2 tiers lower than the vehicle you're shooting. Yeah, you want to guarantee that you're going to have some damage. Now the IS is now going to struggle quite a bit, but the SU-152 probably not so much. But with the SU now bouncing, it is now curtains for the IS-2, and it's time to advance towards the low tier Soviet tank destroyer that has a similar level of alpha. Maybe not as much, but it certainly is supposedly trying to be what the T95 is, but it gets no armor, so it's never going to compete really. And with the Maotian for some reason taking the high ground, not actually managing to think he's Obi-Wan, deciding that he's going to come down the high ground from which he was, and yeah, I don't even know. Of course, only a Maotian player would know the level of plays that was, but of course gifting the T95 here some easy damage, and even if the SU does manage to pen at this point in the game, it's still going to be a easy win since he's never going to bounce off of that tank, and the SU is probably going to bounce off of him with the amount of hit points still left on the T95. That is it. I mean, the game is basically sealed from this point. It is just now up against a tier 7 artillery. Now it does take a solid minute or 2 to be able to get to this point, but he does manage to find the GW Panther, and it's a quick easy exit for the enemy artillery, which we always love to see. And if you do love to see that as well, make sure to check out some of the other videos on the channel, and thank you very much for watching this one.